I want you to imagine lying awake, knowing tomorrow could change the rest of your life. Not next month, not someday, tomorrow. And no matter how many times you close your eyes, your mind keeps returning to the same question. What if it goes badly? Tonight, I want us to sit beside Esther for a moment. Not the queen everyone remembers, just a woman staring into the darkness, trying to steady her breathing before morning comes. I keep thinking about how long that night must have felt, not because scripture tells us, it doesn't, but because most women know what it feels like when tomorrow carries more weight than today. The palace was quiet by then. The conversations had ended. The servants had withdrawn. Even the hallways beyond Esther's room had grown still, but her mind hadn't. She sat near the window for a while, then stood, then sat again. The oil lamp burned low beside her. Outside, the city was dark. Inside, every thought seemed louder than it should have been. Tomorrow, the word kept returning. Tomorrow, she would walk into the king's court without being summoned. Tomorrow, she would take a step that could save her people or end her life. She rubbed her palms together, then stopped when she realized she was doing it, a nervous habit, the kind people don't notice until they're alone. Across the room, the lamp flickered. For a moment, she watched the flame, anything to stop thinking, anything to stop imagining. But her thoughts found their way back. They always do. What if he refuses to see me? What if he is angry? What if Mordecai was wrong?
What if I am not the woman everyone believes I am? That last question lingered longer than the others, because fear has a way of exposing old insecurities. She was queen, but titles don't silence every doubt. Some doubts follow you into every room, even royal ones. Esther crossed the room and touched the curtain near the window. The fabric felt cool beneath her fingers. She looked down into the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, families were asleep, children asleep, mothers asleep, people who had no idea what tomorrow might bring, people who had no idea that their future rested partly in the hands of a woman who couldn't stop pacing her room. The thought made her chest tighten. "Lord," the words slipped out quietly, almost accidentally. Then nothing. No beautiful prayer, no powerful speech, just silence. She rested her forehead against the stone wall beside the window and stood there. Some prayers sound more like exhaustion than confidence. Maybe this was one of them. The fast had ended. The conversations were over. The decision had been made. There was nothing left to organize, nothing left to discuss, nothing left to prepare. Only mourning remained. And sometimes that's the hardest part, when you've done everything you know how to do and all that's left is waiting. She returned to the bed, sat down, then stood again almost immediately. The sheets felt impossible. Rest felt impossible. Sleep felt impossible. She could almost hear Mordecai's voice from days earlier, firm, certain, heavy with urgency. The words had unsettled her then. They still unsettled her now. Because sometimes people see strength in us before we see it ourselves. And instead of feeling encouraging, it feels frightening. What if they're wrong? What if you disappoint them?
What if you step forward and discover you're not as brave as everyone thought? Esther sat again. This time, she stayed there. The room had become very quiet. So quiet, she could hear the crackling of the lamp. So quiet, she could hear her own breathing. Slow, uneven, then slower. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A story she had heard growing up, a story about God making a path where there wasn't one. A story about impossible odds. A story about people who were afraid and moved anyway. She couldn't remember every detail, only the feeling, only the reminder. God had never needed perfect people. That realization settled differently, not like lightning, not like a miracle, more like a knot loosening, slowly, almost unnoticed. She looked toward the doorway. No attendants, no advisors, no Mordecai, no one to reassure her. And strangely, that was when something became clear. Nobody could walk into that throne room for her. Nobody could carry tomorrow for her. But she wouldn't be walking in alone. The thought came quietly, without drama, without certainty, just quietly, the way dawn begins before anyone notices. Esther pulled her knees closer and stared at the dying flame. The fear was still there. That surprised her. She had expected peace to feel different. She had expected courage to erase fear. Instead, they seemed to be sitting in the room together, side by side. The fear remained, but something else had arrived too. Resolve. Small, steady, real. She exhaled slowly.
Tomorrow, then. The words barely rose above a whisper. Nobody answered. Nothing changed. The palace remained silent. The city remained asleep. The risks remained exactly what they had been an hour earlier. But Esther stopped fighting the night. And somewhere between fear and surrender, strength began to take shape. Not the kind people celebrate, the quieter kind. The kind that gets up in the morning, the kind that washes its face, straightens its shoulders, and walks toward the thing it would rather avoid. The lamp finally burned out. Darkness settled across the room. Esther closed her eyes. Tomorrow was still waiting, but for the first time that night, she wasn't trying to outrun it. The room was darker now. Not completely dark, just enough light slipping beneath the doorway to outline the furniture. Esther opened her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether she had slept. Maybe a few minutes, maybe not at all. The knot in her stomach was still there. That answered the question quickly enough. Tomorrow. The thought returned before she could stop it. Tomorrow. She rolled onto her back and stared upward. The ceiling looked different at night. Everything did. Problems did too. Things that seemed manageable in daylight often felt larger after midnight. She let out a slow breath, then another. Outside, somewhere beyond the palace walls, a dog barked. The sound faded. Silence returned. Esther turned onto her side, closed her eyes, opened them again. Sleep wasn't coming, at least not yet. Her mind drifted back to the conversation with Mordecai. Not the entire conversation, just pieces of it. Fragments. The look on his face. The urgency in his voice. The feeling that something bigger than her own life was unfolding. She pulled the blanket higher, not because she was cold, because it gave her something to do with her hands. For a long moment, she simply listened. The quiet, her breathing, the faint crackle from the dying lamp. Then, unexpectedly, a memory surfaced. A childhood memory. One of those moments you don't think about for years and then suddenly remember in perfect detail. She was younger, much younger, sitting beside someone older than herself, listening to stories about the God of Israel. Stories of impossible situations. Stories of people trapped between danger and deliverance. Stories where nobody knew what God was doing until much later. At the time, they had just sounded like stories. Tonight, they felt different.
Tonight, she found herself wondering how those people felt before everything worked out, before the sea opened, before the rescue came, before the miracle. Nobody ever talks about the night before, the waiting, the uncertainty, the part where people still had questions. A small smile touched her face, only for a second, then disappeared, because perhaps they had felt exactly as she felt now, afraid, hopeful, confused, determined, all at once. Esther sat up slowly. The room felt less crowded somehow. The fear was still there, but it no longer felt like the only thing in the room. She rested her feet on the floor, folded her hands together, unfolded them, then folded them again. God. Her voice sounded smaller than she expected. She swallowed, tried again. God, I don't know what tomorrow looks like.
The words hung in the silence. No answer came, at least not the kind she wanted. No voice, no sign, no sudden certainty. Only quiet. Yet she found herself continuing anyway, not because she knew exactly what to say, because she didn't. Just stay with me. That was all. Nothing polished, nothing worthy of being written down. Just 4 simple words. Stay with me. The prayer lingered, and for the first time all night, Esther stopped trying to solve tomorrow, stopped rehearsing conversations, stopped imagining outcomes, stopped reaching for answers she didn't have. Tomorrow would arrive whether she worried or not. The king would respond however he chose. Some things were beyond her reach. They always had been. A strange calm settled over her. Not certainty, something quieter. The realization that she didn't need to carry the entire story, only her part of it. She sat there for a while, breathing, listening, waiting. And eventually, the darkness near the window began to soften, almost imperceptibly. Night was loosening its grip. Morning was coming. Nothing had changed. The king had not changed. The risk had not changed. The future had not changed. But Esther rose from the bed anyway. She straightened her robe, smoothed her sleeves, and stood still for a moment. The fear remained. So did the strength. For some reason, she had always assumed one would replace the other. Instead, they stood side by side, and when the time came, she reached for the door.
Tonight, I'm thinking about Esther. Not the queen people celebrate. The woman who couldn't see the ending yet. The woman who had already made her decision, but still had to live through the night before it. And somehow that feels familiar. Because there are nights when the hardest thing isn't making the decision, it's waiting. It's lying awake after the conversation is over, after the application has been submitted, after the diagnosis, after the text message, after the choice has already been made. Those hours when there is nothing left to do except wait for morning. And if I'm honest, waiting can feel heavier than action. Sometimes the imagination becomes its own burden. One possibility becomes 10, 10 become 50. Before long, entire futures have been built inside our minds. Some frightening, some heartbreaking. Most of them things that never even happen, yet they still steal sleep. They still tighten shoulders. They still leave people staring at ceilings long after midnight. So tonight, before anything else, I just want to sit quietly for a moment, because somebody listening has been carrying more than they admit, carrying responsibilities, carrying expectations, carrying private fears, carrying questions they haven't spoken aloud. And maybe nobody around them realizes how tired they actually are. The smile still appears, the work still gets done, the messages still get answered, the bills still get paid. But underneath all of that,
There is exhaustion, the kind that settles deeper than the body, the kind that comes from carrying uncertainty for too long. For the woman listening tonight who feels that way, I hope she knows she doesn't have to pretend here. She doesn't have to sound brave. She doesn't have to sound positive. She doesn't have to have the right words. Some of the most honest prayers begin when people finally stop trying to sound strong. And maybe that's where we are tonight. Not trying to sound strong, just being honest. Because the truth is, some futures feel frightening. Some doors feel intimidating. Some conversations feel impossible. Some seasons stretch longer than expected. Sometimes courage feels beautiful in other people's stories, and much harder in our own. Sometimes faith feels less like confidence and more like taking one breath after another, one step after another, one day after another. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps God has never required perfection before offering His presence. Perhaps He has never waited for certainty before drawing near. Perhaps He has always been willing to meet people exactly where they are, including here, including tonight. So for the woman whose thoughts keep racing ahead of her, I pray she finds rest, not necessarily answers immediately. Rest. Because those are not always the same thing. Sometimes an answer arrives months later, but rest can arrive now. The kind of rest that reminds a person they are not responsible for carrying every possible outcome. The kind of rest that loosens clenched hands. The kind of rest that allows breathing to slow. The kind of rest that quietly says, "You have done what you can do. The rest does not belong to you." And for the woman who is standing in front of something difficult, I pray she receives strength for the next step. Not strength for next year, not strength for 10 years from now, just enough for the next step. Enough for tomorrow morning, enough for the phone call, enough for the meeting, enough for the decision, enough for whatever is waiting beyond the door. Because sometimes looking too far ahead becomes overwhelming. Life rarely unfolds all at once. Most of it arrives one day at a time, one moment at a time, one act of obedience at a time. And maybe that is mercy. Maybe we were never meant to carry the entire road at once. Only today's portion, only today's grace, only today's assignment. I'm also thinking tonight about women who have spent so much time caring for everyone else that they barely recognize their own exhaustion anymore. Women who keep showing up, keep helping, keep supporting, keep giving, long after their own reserves feel empty. Women who have become so accustomed to being strong that asking for help feels unfamiliar. Women who quietly hold entire households together. Women who carry emotional burdens nobody else sees. Women who often receive appreciation far later than they deserve. I pray they encounter gentleness tonight. Not pressure, not performance. Gentleness. The reminder that their value was never dependent upon how much they carry. The reminder that being loved and being useful are not the same thing. The reminder that they do not have to earn rest. The reminder that they are allowed to exhale, allowed to pause, allowed to be held by God instead of holding everything themselves. And for the woman who feels afraid, I pray she does not mistake fear for failure. Because fear is not always evidence that something is wrong. Sometimes fear appears right before courage is needed. Esther walked toward the throne room with fear. That fear did not disqualify her. It simply walked beside her. And perhaps someone listening needs that reminder. The presence of fear does not mean the absence of faith. The presence of fear does not mean God has abandoned you. The presence of fear does not mean you are weak.
It may simply mean you are human, and God has always known that. Always. So tonight, for every woman listening, I pray for steady hearts. Not perfect hearts, steady hearts. I pray for clear minds when thoughts begin to spiral. I pray for calm in places where anxiety has been loud. I pray for wisdom where decisions feel complicated. I pray for comfort where grief still lingers. I pray for courage where tomorrow feels uncertain. And most of all, I pray for the quiet assurance that no one walks through these nights alone. Not Esther, not the women listening now, not any of us. So as this day comes to an end, may the questions become a little quieter. May the shoulders relax a little more. May sleep come more easily. May strength meet you in the morning. And when tomorrow finally arrives, may you discover what Esther discovered, that courage does not always arrive before the step. Sometimes it arrives while you're taking it. Amen. Morning eventually came for Esther. The door opened, the waiting ended, and she walked toward the thing that had kept her awake all night. Maybe that's the thought to carry with you tonight. Not that she stopped being afraid, just that fear wasn't the thing that made her decision. So if tomorrow is holding something difficult for you, let tonight be enough for tonight. Rest if you can. Breathe a little slower, and trust that when morning comes, you'll find the strength to meet it.